Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Jim Rogers, renowned investor and world traveler. And Jim really needs no further introduction. If you don't know who Jim Rogers is, you've probably been living in a cave in Afghanistan or someplace. So it's really a pleasure to have Jim with me. Thanks for joining me again, Jim.
Well, Jay, I'm delighted to be here. It's been a while.
It's been a while. We've enjoyed your conversations with me many times in the past. I do have to ask you, though, Jim, it's been, how long has it been since you left New York City?
We left permanently in 2007. Yeah, 2007.
You sold your place over there by the Hudson River somewhere, and
Yep.
And then went to Singapore. Any regrets for having done so?
No. If anything, regrets are I didn't leave sooner. It's when I left, I really had second thoughts, third thoughts, regrets. I almost backed out and didn't do it. But now, when I go back to New York, I'm really glad that I live in Asia instead of in New York in 2016, 15, whenever I'm there. New York continues to decline. America continues to decline, and Asia's on the rise. I still love New York. I love America, etc., but I'm very glad my children are growing up in Asia.
Jim, why do you think America's in decline?
Well, there are many reasons, obviously, that nations peak and then go into decline. Perhaps the main reason right now, if I have to put my finger on one thing, it would be the debt in America. Every nation in world history that's gotten itself into such huge debt situations has suffered. It's a simple fact. I don't like saying it. I'm an American voter and taxpayer just like you. But the debt, America is now the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, Jay, and it's getting worse every day. When you have a lot of debt, it's hard to grow in a dynamic and dramatic fashion because you always have that debt pulling you down or holding you back. I guess that's the single question. Now, you might say, well, why do we have the debt? Who knows? That goes back to education, lots of things that are not taking place in America, I should say.
Well, Jim, it seems to me, I was brought up in Ohio in a fairly conservative area, and the idea that we had was you save for the future. You build your capital that way, and the only way a country can really grow and become more prosperous is by forming capital that you use to grow your economy with. Somehow we've forgotten that. It seems that everything is on the Keynesian wavelength that we need to somehow consume to get richer. It never made any sense to me, except in the short run perhaps you can stimulate growth that way. But is that the kind of education you're talking about, this notion that you can just consume your way to prosperity?
Well, that's certainly part of it. I mean, when I say education, I mean many things. Reading, writing, and arithmetic, for instance. My children go to school in Asia, public schools in Asia, and Jay, everything you may have heard about Asian education is true. It's amazing how advanced, how rigorous. My children have had more homework in the first 3 or 4 years than I had in 12 years in the U.S. One of my girls ran into a student at there's an American school here, and she came home in like the 3rd or 4th grade, and just matter of fact said, oh, they don't have homework at the American school. And she had 3 or 4 or 5 hours a day as a little girl. So there are lots of things. It's just amazing the difference in Asian education and U.S. education. And even when I was a kid, education was much better in the U.S., but it's certainly Asian education is far, far ahead of it. But the basic principle you mentioned, which is you save your money and invest for the future in order to try to come out okay, is a very, very basic point, but we don't use it in America anymore, especially the central bank. Jay, the way things are supposed to work is you save your money and everything is okay in the end. In America right now, we are destroying the people who save their money and invest for the future. Whether you're a pension plan or an insurance company or an endowment, you're getting zero interest, and it's all being done to bail out the people who did it the wrong way. The people went deep into debt with no assets, no income, etc. I mean, this is going to end just horribly, Jay, just terribly. And history shows we're going to suffer badly.
You know, Jim, we're thought of as a capitalist country, and yet it seems to me the ignorance with respect to capitalism is it's just astounding. What the question I have in my mind is, how can you have a capitalist system when the central banks do not allow pricing of capital? When they're distorting the pricing mechanism of capital, how can you have capitalism if you're destroying capital itself, right?
Well, Jay, it's a very insightful point. You know, in Washington right now, they blame a shout to other people, other nations, that you're manipulating something, the currency, the markets, whatever. My gosh, the biggest manipulation in world history, starting right there in Washington, D.C., where they're manipulating the price of capital, the currency, the price of everything. It's amazing. And yet they blame other people for doing the same thing.
And yet we're considered a capitalist country. And what my point is, I don't see how anybody could consider us a capitalist country when we're going the route more of socialism and I don't know, fascism, whatever you want to call it. It certainly isn't free market capitalism. But in any event, I mean, this just seems like pure lunacy to me, the central bank notion of not only zero interest rates now, but negative interest rates. I think I saw the other day that something like $7 trillion in debt around the world is now negative interest rates receiving on, I don't know if that's true or not, but a big, we have negative interest rates in Japan and elsewhere. I just can't imagine. And then they're talking about, bail-ins, and then they're talking about, if there's bail-ins, people are going to want to take their money out, so we're going to have to make it illegal to own cash. I mean, I can't. Is this a reality, Jim, in the West, or do you see that sort of thing possibly happening elsewhere in the world, or are you safe in Singapore?
You're not going to be safe anywhere, Jay, when the problems really hit, because America is the largest economy in the world. Europe as a whole is an even bigger economy. Japan is a huge economy. It's happening in Japan, too. So even if a country is doing things right, it doesn't matter, because nobody can be isolated and exempt from all the terrors which are coming to all of us, I'm afraid.
I'm just wondering, the craziness in the central bank seems to, in my mind, to be equal only to the craziness that seems to be going on in American politics this year, in this presidential election year. I'd love to know what your thoughts are about how the rise of Sanders on the one hand and Trump on the other. What do you think? How do you explain that?
Well, Jay, whenever there are difficult times, somebody rises. Whether you want to call them a man on a white horse or a dictator or whatever you want to call them, whenever you have serious problems, you have new and strange people, what are considered at the time strange people. So it's not unusual that we have, what do you want to call them, off-the-wall candidates. I'm surprised we don't have more. And I don't know how this election is going to come out, but I do know that the next election is going to be even worse, because by then the wall will really be falling down all around us. And so who knows what we will elect at that time. You have a man come along on a white horse, and that may be Donald Trump or Sanders or whoever, and they say, don't worry, I will save you. Listen to me. And they come up with absurd policies, but people vote for them. I'm not going to name names, but you know history as well as I do. It's happened many, many, many times, and we've all suffered.
Yeah, I wonder, because as a world traveler, I guess you're spending most of your time in Singapore. You do get around a lot, though, I'm sure, still, Jim. And I'm wondering, what are you hearing from other countries? Are they concerned about what's going on in America and American politics this year?
Well, everybody's concerned about America, period, and where America might go. I mean, either, no matter who of the major candidates, no matter who wins, Jay, it's not going to be good for America or good for the world. If Donald Trump does the things he says he's going to do, I mean, we're going to have trade wars with half the world. Well, trade wars have always throughout history led to bankruptcy and led to war. I don't know if he means what he says. I don't even know if he knows if he means what he says. But Sanders, of course, will bankrupt us very, very quickly. Hillary Clinton, for God's sake, she's a disaster too. The bankruptcy will just be slower. That's all. If she's elected, so I don't see any prospects for salvation for the U.S. from the present people who are likely to become president of the United States.
Well, Jim, speaking of trade, who's, how can you not be in favor of free trade? Everybody, all economists from every persuasion pretty much is in favor of free trade. Ron Paul has made the point, though, why do you need the TPP? Why do you need all these trade agreements when, in fact, all you really need to do is agree to cut tariffs by the same amount across the boards? I'm interested in knowing what, especially given your location there in Asia, what your thoughts are about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and other such agreements. Favorable or non?
Well, any kind of free trade, as you've already said, is good for everybody. Everybody, most people, not everybody, of course, but
sure.
Everybody in the end comes out ahead with free trade, whether you call it TPP or open markets or whatever you want to call it. Any way we can get to free trade is normally better for the world. Now, with TPP, I don't know all that's in there, Jay, because they won't tell us.
Yeah, they don't tell us, right.
We live in the land of the free, and they won't even tell us what we're supposedly voting on or what our people are voting on. But any kind of free trade, in the end, is better for everybody. Always has been. Now, Donald Trump says he's against free trade. So, which, of course, when you close borders and you raise tariffs, the Great Depression in the 1929 and 30s was caused by an attack on free trade, if you remember.
Sure.
So we could well have all of that again and worse.
We're, I gather you're not bullish on the equity markets now, Jim? In general?
No, I'm not. I'm not. It's been, 8 years since we had, or 7 or 8 years since we've had any kind of major correction in most markets in the world. So we're well overdue. There are many reasons we're going to have problems, but no, I'm not terribly optimistic about shares in most of the world.
Well, another very well-known investor like yourself, I put him in the same class as Stan Druckenmiller. He's come out the other day, saying get out of stocks, and he's favorably disposed towards gold. How do you feel about gold these days?
Well, I own gold. I haven't bought gold in several years, as you probably or may remember. I own it. I haven't sold my gold. I expect another opportunity to buy gold, and if it happens, I hope I'm smart enough to buy a lot. If it doesn't happen, I still own gold, Jay.
Mm-hmm. Store of value, a store of wealth, long term, not to be thought of as an investment necessarily, but just a store of wealth. Is that the way you view it?
Well, look at it as an insurance policy, if nothing else. Everybody listening to this has health insurance, car insurance, fire insurance, etc. You hope you never need it. If nothing else, your gold is a great insurance policy, and it might make you a lot of money as well. Your fire insurance policy is not going to make you money. Gold might serve you as insurance, and it might make you a lot of money.
Jim, you're so familiar with the world, because I don't know of anybody that not only have you traveled the world a couple of times, one around the world, but you spent lots of time with common folks in various countries around the world. You didn't just stay in fancy hotels, which you can do anytime, but even at times your life and the life of your fiance, as I recall, one of your trips was endangered at least once. So you really have absorbed the culture, the nuances of these countries. I think you know these countries as well as any other human being alive, perhaps. There's a historian and prolific writer, William Engdahl, that I have on my show frequently. He's been talking about China's strategic One Belt, One Road Eurasian and Asian infrastructure project that he says has the potential to act as a positive growth engine for countries from China through Russia, Belarus, and into Eastern and even Central Europe. Now, you've traveled, as I say, you've been all through these places, and what is your thought of this new, what's referred to sometimes as a new Silk Road? Do you have a sense as to how realistic this endeavor is? Is it going to be a big thing for those countries, do you think, Jim?
Jay, it's not often in world history that geography changes. The clipper ship changed geography, railroads changed geography, the Spanish sailors changed geography. This is one of the few times in world history that geography is changing again. They're going to open up huge parts of the world that have been more or less isolated for a long time. Some people are going to get extraordinarily rich. Some are going to suffer as geography changes. I live in Singapore, which has got, until recently, the largest port in the world and the most important port in Asia. Well, this is going to bypass, it's going to certainly not help Singapore at all going forward, because now you can put goods on a train and they'll get to Berlin or Rome or wherever a couple of weeks faster. This is an astonishing change that's taking place, and it's one of the most important events of our lifetime.
Interesting. It just seems to me, from where we sit here in the U.S. with the propaganda that we get every day from our mainstream media, all we hear about is the evil Vladimir Putin and how the Russian economy is on the ropes thanks to our sanctions and lower oil prices. Yet from what I can read, it seems as though Russia may, in fact, in some ways, be in better shape than the U.S., and in that it doesn't have much debt. You talked about the importance of debt. I believe Russia has something like 18% of GDP in debt. They've been building up their gold reserves massively. China has as well. And we're seeing reports now that Russia and China are trading, Russia selling oil to China, Iran selling oil to China, not for dollars, as the petrodollar regime required, and the United States military seemingly has been involved in enforcing, but in fact those countries seem to be trading using their own currencies and gold. Do you have any thoughts about this? Is this something perhaps that is really people should really be focused on, in that we have these geopolitical alignments that seem to be springing up now?
Well, Jay, as I sit every day, I'm astounded at how many mistakes they make in Washington, D.C. We're driving the Chinese and the Russians together, driving many Asians together. That in the end, that's going to be a huge benefit to all of them, because there are 3 billion people in Asia. Russia has huge amounts of natural resources, et cetera, and we're driving them together. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. Some Europeans are starting to wake up and realize, oh my gosh, what's going on here? But no, this is a major, major historic shift. And as I said, we're changing political and economic history. We're changing geography, but it's all towards Asia and Central Asia. It's not driving us towards the U.S. And I don't like saying this at all. I sit and just watch these guys make one mistake after another.
It's interesting to note. I know that James Turk, who we've had on this show, has pointed out in the past that generally speaking, you see gold follow the wealth. So where wealth is being created, as you pointed out many times, the Chinese, for all of their problems they have, certainly a lot of debt themselves, but they are creating things that the rest of the world needs. America basically is just a consumer society now, producing less and less of what I consider wealth-creating industries, mining, manufacturing, and the like. I'm just wondering where this is going to go, because it doesn't sound good. It sounds as if we are really, as you say, shooting ourselves in the foot. If we could trade with these countries, if we could get along with these countries, but somehow there always seems to be somebody who's trying to, they have another agenda perhaps. So I'm wondering, Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex. We went off the gold standard in 71, I believe, correct me if you have a different view of this, in part because some people wanted to have a war in Southeast Asia, some people wanted to have socialism in America, and Nixon didn't want to tell the American people they had to pay for it, and we wanted to issue debt to pay for it, and so we did, and then we set up a petrodollar. Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia and arranged with the OPEC countries to demand payment in dollars, thereby putting a bid on the dollar, and ever since then the dollar has been king. How do you see the dollar now? I mean, short term and longer term, Jim. How do you see the dollar?
Well, I own U.S. dollars more than any other currency at the moment. It is a terribly flawed currency, Jay, a terribly flawed currency. And unfortunately, I'm afraid in our lifetime it will become a mere shadow of its former self. I own it now because there's so many problems coming and so much turmoil coming, and people will look for a safe haven. Mm-hmm. They think the dollar is a safe haven, and historically it has been. It will not be in the future. But when the problems come, they're not going to buy the euro. They're not going to buy a lot of things. They'll buy the dollar. The dollar will go up. It will become overpriced, maybe even turn into a bubble. I hope at that point that I'm smart enough to sell and put my money somewhere else. And at that point, if things happen the way they often do, when the dollar goes up, it's very strong. Gold, for instance, doesn't go up. If it happens that way, I may swap my dollars for gold at that point. But who knows? Who knows? That's the future.
Well, I think. I'm sorry, Jim.
I own the dollar right now, even though I intellectually and economically it is indefensible. But unfortunately, most other things are indefensible too right now, and that's why I own U.S. dollars.
Well, I think you have pointed out in the past, and I think you probably practice it, that it's best to diversify, and that's, as you noted earlier, you own gold as an insurance and an alternative currency, if you will, that at some point in time may come in handy as a wealth preservation asset. But commodities in general, I guess if you see the dollar remaining strong, it's very difficult to know where the tipping point is, isn't it, Jim? It's impossible to know when times are going to change, when psychology might change, when forces that come into play, wars, or, who knows, the man on the white horse that comes in to rescue us. But so I guess that's a diversification, the reason you want to own things. Commodities, you're known for your commodities. I still trace the Rogers Commodity Fund every day. And in general, what do you think of commodities now?
Well, commodities have been beaten down in recent months, recent years. I suspect that most of them, if not all of them, are making a bottom. It's a complicated bottom, such as oil, gold, certainly agriculture. I'd rather be a buyer of commodities at this stage than of stocks anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jim, as a world traveler, as somebody who have said, you've been around more than anybody else I know, and you've learned to know not just the wealthy people in fancy places and expensive cities, but you've really learned to know the people and the countries, I think, as well as anybody. Is there any place, you're in Singapore, I suspect you feel relatively safe there, but is there any place where people might go, people who cherish freedom and the opportunities to use their God-given talents? Is there any place on earth besides Singapore, or where can we go? Is there any place to go? It used to be the United States. I felt that we were safe here. Is there any place we can go to be safe? I guess the answer is probably there's no place you can be sure of, right?
Well, there's no place at the moment that I know of. Even Singapore, as I said before, the port here is the most important port in Asia, and if things blow up, everybody needs that port. And Singapore has a lot of Muslim neighbors, too, that could turn into a problem someday. Where would one go? I think one needs to find an isolated place. I guess maybe some places in South America may be a way to make it through. Some places in Asia. North Korea, I'm very optimistic. North Korea has dramatic changes taking place. It's where China was in 1981. But if there's a war, North Korea is probably going to be involved. All of Korea is probably going to be involved, too. So you need to find a place, Jay, that's not in the mainstream where people don't really care too much. But even that, you have to be careful, because you might wind up in a place where the armies are using you as a highway or as a transit point. So you have to be careful.
Well, I think probably still your travel books are still worth reading, even though time changes things a bit. Your Adventure Capital was one that I have in my bookshelves here, and also a more recent book, Street Smart. Talk to us a little bit about Street Smart.
Well, my publisher said to me at one point, you should put all this together, because you've ridden around the world, you've invested in commodities in China and all sorts of things. But why don't you put it together, how you came from the backwoods of Alabama, and now you're living in Asia with a couple of Chinese-speaking children, by blonde-haired children who speak Chinese. How'd this happen? So I doubt if anybody would be interested, but he persuaded me, and so it's really sort of a memoir of how it all happened, and it's largely, as most of my books are, a discussion about the world, including the investment world, but it starts off in Alabama and it winds up in Singapore.
Interesting. Well, you've had a most interesting life, and I hope it lasts many more years, Jim, because you're a treasure. You're somebody that is very helpful to people who love freedom and liberty, and well, you're just a gift to our world. And I want to thank you for joining us again. Anything else you'd like to add before we conclude our discussion today?
I urge people to become knowledgeable. They should listen to you and other people like you, because the world is facing some very complicated and difficult times. Once you become knowledgeable, you're going to get very worried, which you should, and then you might get prepared, because not all of us are going to survive what's coming in the next few years. I hope I survive. I hope everybody listening to this survives, but it's going to be a very, very damaging and difficult time. So be worried, be prepared.
All right, Jim, one last question. How can people keep up with, I mean, we see you on television from time to time, less frequently than we used to, but how can people keep up with you? Are you writing things, or is there some place where people can tap into your wisdom from time to time?
No, I guess you mentioned I am in the press sometimes. I guess YouTube or what are those things called? Sure. I don't have a Twitter account. I don't have a Facebook. I don't have a blog. I don't have anything. So I guess you just have to find me when somebody like you is interested in listening to me talk.
Oh, my goodness. Well, we're going to try to do that more often, because it's always a pleasure hearing from you. You just enjoy your family, Jim. It's a wonderful story. You got 2 girls, I believe, there, and you're teaching them Mandarin. They're learning Mandarin. Not you're teaching them, but they're learning it. Very wisely, you have them learning it. And anyway, it's very interesting. We hope to talk to you again sometime soon, Jim.
Thank you, Jay. Let's do it again. You're right. On the rise. I still love New York. I love America, etc. But I'm very glad my children are growing up in Asia.
Jim, why do you think America's in decline?
Well, there are many reasons. Obviously, that nations peak and then go into decline. Perhaps the main reason right now, if I have to put my finger on one thing, it would be the debt in America. Every nation in world history that's gotten itself into such huge debt situations has suffered. It's a simple fact. I don't like saying it. I'm an American voter and taxpayer just like you. But the debt, America is now the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, Jay, and it's getting worse every day. When you have a lot of debt, it's hard to grow in a dynamic and dramatic fashion, because you always have that debt pulling you down or holding you back. I guess that's the single question. Now, you might say, well, why do we have the debt? Who knows? That goes back to education, lots of things that are not taking place in America, I should say.
Well, Jim, it seems to me, I was brought up in Ohio, in a fairly conservative area, and the idea that we had was you save for the future. You build your capital that way, and the only way a country. Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Jim Rogers, renowned investor and world traveler. And Jim really needs no further introduction. If you don't know who Jim Rogers is, you've probably been living in a cave in Afghanistan or someplace. So it's really a pleasure to have Jim with me. Thanks for joining me again, Jim.
Well, Jay, I'm delighted to be here. It's been a while.
It's been a while. We've enjoyed your conversations with me many times in the past. I do have to ask you, though, Jim, how long has it been since you left New York City?
We left permanently in 2007.
You can really grow and become more prosperous is by forming capital that you use to grow your economy with. Somehow we've forgotten that. It seems that everything is on the Keynesian wavelength, that we need to somehow consume to get richer. It never made any sense to me, except in the short run, perhaps you can stimulate growth that way. But is that the kind of education you're talking about, this notion that you can just consume your way to prosperity?
Well, that's certainly part of it. I mean, when I say education, I mean many things. Reading, writing, and arithmetic, for instance. My children go to school in Asia, public schools in Asia. And Jay, 2007.
You sold your place over there by the Hudson River somewhere, and
yep.
And then went to Singapore. Any regrets for having done so?
No, no, no. If anything, regrets are I didn't leave sooner. It's when I left, I really had second thoughts, third thoughts, regrets. I almost backed out and didn't do it. But now, when I go back to New York, I'm really glad that I live in Asia instead of in New York in 2016, 15, whenever I'm there. New York continues to decline, America continues to decline, and Asia's